Good afternoon, everybody. Before we get started with today's presentation, I wanted to give a quick shout out to the people who organized Earth Overshoot Day, and as it had previously been known, Ecological Debt Day. It appears that it started in 1971, although this is the 27th anniversary of what has been labeled Earth Overshoot Day. You might remember that in 1970, we had our first Earth Day. Anyway, today marks the day on which the Earth produced for the year what humanity has consumed. And so we're now in ecological debt. Unfortunately, conservation authorities don't really seem to have attacked this debt the way that they have with fiscal debts. Anyway, thanks to Dr. William Rees, Bill Rees, all known to all of us, previously associated with the Club of Rome and with CACOR, and Mathis Wackernagel, who was one of his students. We do have Earth Overshoot Day, and unfortunately, it's getting closer and closer to the beginning of the year. So with a little bit of chagrin, we can all celebrate the day and hope that, in fact, we'll get it moving in the other direction before long. So thanks very much, and on to John.
Gordon, I need your slide, please.
There you go.
There you are. It is my pleasure to introduce again Gordon, who spoke to us about 2 weeks ago exactly. And after seeing and hearing what he had to say then, and you can quickly on your screen just double check, you can see his background. But if you go to the end of the second paragraph, this is a reminder that his presentation dealt with social density stress 2 weeks ago. And it's all the more necessary that he now, at this presentation, will try to show us that one does not have to be either a denier or a doomster. So he will be going into a fascinating area, and as a Franciscan, you will see as he goes into it how fascinating it is. So it is with great pleasure that I pass to you Gordon Kubanek, who will give us another path, which is one that we could perhaps use very well, profitably and usefully. Gordon, over to you.
Thank you very much, John. I really appreciate it. And it's a pleasure to have you sharing your valuable time with us on this beautiful day, at least where I am here south of Ottawa. This is going to be really quite different. So I want to warn you about that. There will be things like poems read. So I'm warning you, get your eyeglasses ready. I will be asking you to read poems out loud to yourself, a word of warning. Rather than looking at the typical conversation that we heard before the recording started, which talked about the heating of the ocean, so that those external challenges, today is looking at the other half of the human experiences, which is our inner journeys, our inner selves, our beliefs, our thoughts, and our emotions, with the exploring the idea that that is at least as important as all our conversations about what's happening out there. As John said, I am a Third Order Franciscan, and I will explain later exactly what that means. But in a nutshell, I try to live my life inspired by the vision of Francis of Assisi as a regular married person with a regular job. So we'll start off with a very traditional Franciscan meditation, which goes like this. May you be blessed with discomfort at easy answers, half-truth and superficial relationships. so that you may live deep within your heart. May you be blessed with enough foolishness to believe that you can make a difference in this world, however remote the chance, and do what others claim cannot be done. The title of today's talk is called Beyond Denial, a Franciscan perspective. I make no attempt to say here that this is the truth or the path. This is simply one person's experience as he's tried to walk the tightrope between denial and saying everything is fine, and doom, which is give up. There's no point. We may as well, not bother because there's nothing we can do. So where's that tightrope between that, and how I have tried to walk that and see how my lessons learned can be possibly helpful to the greater society at large. I will make the caveat once again, this is with the understanding that these challenges are actually always social in nature. So a Franciscan path is always social. You're always with other people and with creation. Outline is pretty straightforward. I'm just going to set the stage. Where are we at in the world in terms of denial and doom? What is it about the Franciscan path that I hope can be helpful? And once again, this does not presume that you have to be a Christian or a Franciscan or anything. There are some sort of basic touchstones that can be looked at as universally human characteristics. I do make the conclusion or bring us in the direction that perhaps we can become indigenous again. We once were connected with the land, and we lost that connection both with the earth and with each other, and we can return to that. We'll explore that. I come to some, I call sort of practical parts that as things unravel, there's going to be a lot of grief, but also room for what's called post-traumatic growth. And these inner journeys and these inner challenges, what we're looking at is how do you develop the inner resources not to be overwhelmed and not to sort of basically give up or deny. And then, of course, there's a finale. The key word in all of that is a very dangerous word, and something that we at the Club of Rome are not, I'd say, generally comfortable with, and that word is belief. This cycle here is a typical cycle describing self-fulfilling prophecies, where the actions that we take are really coming from our belief, and the results then confirm or are rejected by our beliefs, which may have to be modified. So I'm looking at that inner journey. So it's the inner challenges and how they interact with the outer world. Set the stage. This is Grey Owl. He was Canada's first environmentalist. His real name is Archie Bellany, and he is a hero or anti-hero, depending upon who you talk with. And I think he has a lot to teach us. So he's like a metaphor of us, of saying, you know what, there's something, we've been disconnected from the land and each other, and there's something that about the really being truly human, which we have missed in our industrial urban society, that we need to learn from. And he said the following, that the world is changed by persons with faith, spirit, emotion, compassion, intuition, and irrational thinking, and not by charts and models and measurements. Now, of course, I'm not saying that we can all be irrational, but it's part of the story. It's part of who we are, and we need to include it as we move forward with our mission in the Club of Rome. My personal tale is pretty simple. I got very sick and almost died about 20 years ago, and I had to make significant changes in my life. I had to accept a lot of loss of what I had been able to do, and that then transformed me, and I think mostly in a good way. So the tale of acceptance of loss and then transformation is a tale that I hope and I think applies to all of us, not just as individuals though, but at a social level. The particular path that I chose is I joined CACOR. I became a Green Party politician, which are really actions in the outer world based upon reason, something that we're very familiar with. Something that most of us are not really that familiar with is the inner world of faith and acceptance and knowing our limits inside our souls. And that is represented by the third order. That funny looking cross you're seeing is a Tau cross, which is the particular cross worn by Franciscans. I'm going to propose right now that just like I had to accept certain loss before I could transform and change my life and things to change, I had to really go through some inner reality. So rather than focusing on the outward world, so my challenges had to do with my heart and, having an income. Those are all valid, well-discussed topics in CACOR. The inner realities, I'm not going to go through the list, but today's discussion is all about these inner, call them psychological, call them personal, call them whatever word you want to do. We're exploring those inner realities that need to be faced for us to be capable to deal with the outer challenges which are out there, with the key caveat that this is together. This is not I'm going to go on my mountain and meditate all day and all will be well. No, this is all about us together being able to do things. And it's about transformation. So our society is in the middle of this transformation, just like a butterfly transforming. It is difficult and has a lot of risk, but it brings life. So let's look at where we're at. The reality is that we have a bunch of events going on in the world. This summer has been particularly interesting. It just so happens I chose this headline about Arizona because I was in Arizona a month ago, and it was like, thank goodness I'm not there now. So you've all read the headlines. This has gone around the world. You fall on the pavement, you get a 3rd-degree burn. And hot off the press today is this bit of news that there's something called a green lash. I read this literally half an hour ago, that it's a backlash about any green attempts to basically actually confront and deal with the climate and environmental destruction. And an example, of course, many of us are familiar with the Republican governor in Florida. And what he has done is he has barred state and local officials from investing any money that promotes environmental sustainable goals. And he has said, we do not want them engaged in ideological joyrides, which is just psychologically fascinating and understandable given where people are at. The picture you're seeing is the same kind of thing happening in England. Similar kinds of motions and changes in laws are happening in Poland. So it's not just Florida. This is really happening around in many countries. The psychological term for that is called the normalcy bias, which is people, when things change a lot and there's a crisis, rather than panic, it turns out they just want things to be normal. In this case, this is the fire in Utah. So they said, well, the normal thing we do is we sit outside and have fireworks. And so we're just going to sit in the lawn and enjoy the show. And of course, this could come down there and kill them. Now, this was a very big fire in Utah. And psychologically, what we found is when things are particularly deadly, especially when it's social, not just me, but the incredible us, we become in a group, we become docile. We do the opposite of what you'd think we would in terms of a reactive and irrational way. We actually sleepwalk into a nightmare. And that's what's happening. We just want things to be normal. This is, of course, part 2 of the presentation I did with my wife in July. And the term that we use at that time is called reactance. And we are absolutely seeing this. This is a very, once again, normal and understandable reaction when your freedom of choice is threatened or you feel it's lost. You resist any influence, anything which you see as a threat just makes you aggressive and angry and all the more irrational. But this is normal. This is what we are like. And we have to accept and learn and work with this inner reality if we expect any changes to happen. And as you know, the real effectiveness in terms of all the good work that has been done has been relatively minimal for the efforts, certainly if you look at GHG emissions. So together, and here's another example, this is tourists on the island of Rhodes. There's been record tourism to the hottest, most uncomfortable places in Europe, which to me makes absolutely no sense. But if I understand the psychology of reactants, it then does make sense. That's one reaction. That's the most common reaction. The other reaction, which is gaining steam, is despair, as evidenced by the climate doomers, and basically says that we're past the point of doing anything. We're going to go extinct. It's all hopeless. Don't bother, forget about it. And there's no hope for the planet. I give up. This, unfortunately, is gaining traction. Today's talk is about weaving a path between those two extremes. I have this picture sort of capture what I'm trying to do today. So this, once again, I'm using a metaphor of there are two devils, two extremes. You see this sort of spirit on the right, which is I'm in denial. Everything is fine. I want everything to be normal. I don't want to hear anything. Please don't tell me because I won't listen anyway. And the other extreme, characterized by this face over here, is we're doomed. We're in despair. We're going extinct. Don't bother. Life, I'm proposing, is somewhere between. We do accept that things are hard, but we don't, and we face things, but we don't say it's easy. It's very difficult. There's this inner path of acceptance and transformation is what we're going to explore today, which is an inner path. It has nothing to do with ocean temperatures or technology or anything. It's what's inside our minds, hearts, and souls. I'm going to let you read this poem. As I warned you, there are going to be poems. I do daily readings as a Franciscan, and this particular gentleman, David White, is also a third order Franciscan, which means he has a regular family. So I'm going to give you a minute to read the poem. If you can, read it out loud, because poems are meant to be read out loud. So I'm going to give you now a minute to do that. Enjoy. I'm going to hope you've had enough time for that. And because it's a poem, I'm certainly not going to explain it. You take out of it as you, whatever you wish. Part two is, what is it about the Franciscan path that I propose would be helpful given the state that we're in? The picture of the bridge goes like this. We have our existing world on the left, and the world we need to go to in the future, and we need a bridge, like a way to get there. How do we get there? There are at least three reasons why I think this particular journey, which I have chosen to take, is helpful within our culture. So not at a personal level, but really at the level of our society. The first thing is that any inner path at all, whatever path it is you choose that is inner, supports your inner struggles so that your outer work can be more transformational. You can be more effective out there if you've worked on the stuff inside you. That inner work allows us to accept loss, that things are going to be gone, that there's going to be pain and grieving. There will be grief, but that like the butterfly is going to allow us to give us that space for transformation, to see doors which seem, as they're closing, we see other doors opening. Thirdly, in particular, because Franciscan comes from our European heritage, or Western civilization, whatever term you have, that this is a way that the basis from our particular culture to not be filled with self-loathing. There is right now in the West, especially among the young people, a real sense of disgust with what our culture coming out of Europe and the Americas has done to other peoples and to the world, and to reject it totally, not helpful, because that sort of rejection and self-loathing is exactly what happens with people who are addicted and are in a spiral of self-destruction. So it's a positive path coming from us before we were this sort of MTI, military, industrial, technological society. So we can see within us a germ of good. Here's some details about St. Francis, which some of you may know or not know. He is the patron saint of the environment. He has many famous quotes, some of which he actually said, and some of which were inspired by him. And it's hard to know which is which. So he is said to have said, we are to live simply so that others may simply live. He was very dubious of money. He had grown up very wealthy and rejected it. The picture here you see is a painting from the 14th century of him marrying Lady Poverty. This was simply a figurative, symbolic act where he saw poverty as freeing, because as we see later on, he had this idea that we don't own stuff, stuff owns us, unless we're very, very careful. He also, through his experience, and this was, by the way, he lived around the 1200 to 1220 when he was an adult, was the time when mercantilism and trade and money was restarting in medieval Europe. He saw wealth as separating us from each other, from God. You can call God whatever you want, the mystery that is out there, and nature. And all it does is this worship of wealth accelerates inequality. He was dubious of book learning, which didn't have heart and body as part of it. He was not an excessively learned man himself. And even though great intellectuals came in the Franciscan tradition, it's always been saying we have to have our head connected to our heart and our body. So this is pre-Cartesian dualism kind of thinking. And something that most people don't know, so within the Christian fold, salvation was seen, in other words, who is important, who matters, was all created beings. So he has very much a focus that whatever we do, there is a sort of a sense of equality between the human and the non-human world. And you will be reading a poem that he wrote about that in a couple of slides. Another perspective, not Franciscan directly, but I would say in the same spirit, are the ideas and writings of a Jewish theologian called Martin Buber. I'll start with a quote at the top from Alan Watts. It says, "Life and reality are not things that you can have for yourself unless you accord them to all others." And certainly what we've done in our industrial capitalistic society, we've turned anything which is not human into a thing. It is simply a resource. A forest standing has no value, but a chopped bunch of 2x4s do, because they are in it. So what Buber talks about, and this is very Franciscan, we're trying all relationships, means the relationship even within ourselves, and relationship with people, relationship with the world, with nature, with animals and plants. It must move from an I-it, where it's a thing, to an I-thou. So a thou is another piece of life, a piece of creation, which has as equal value, and it needs to be accorded as much respect as you get. And this is part of the journey of transformation, which I think is necessary. Opening up the can of worms even more. So we're expanding from this world of the interior, because we're exploring our inner world, from a Franciscan to a Jewish theologian to a book I read about, I guess about 10 years ago, is thinking that this idea of belief and this interior reality is really very much based upon how the brain functions and how it's built. So it is fundamentally to the way the brain functions that belief is there. For example, there's a famous statistician says all theories are wrong, but some are useful. So any belief is a theory. Everything I'm proposing today is theoretical, but some are useful. So I hope whatever theories I propose, beliefs I propose, can be useful. We, of course, many of us are believers in science, but science itself is a belief that was created by a particular culture at a particular time. Once again, if you think of that image I showed you of the two devils, you can think of those two devils and those two extremes as also one is to exclude reason and the other is to admit there is nothing but reason. We are trying to go right up the middle, but understanding that beliefs come first and explanations come after that. And that's why this interior journey is so important as we do what we need to do in the world using reason, but understanding what is the engine that is inside of how our human body and mind work together. One of our beliefs that is obviously destroying us, and this is something that I think would be straightforward for you, is that believing in growth as the answer to everything has turned us into addicts. Now, most of you say, oh, well, I'm not a drug addict. I'm not an addict of alcohol or anything. Well, I always just define addiction in a general sense. It is any activity with short-term pleasure or reward, knowing you know that in the long term, there is damage and probable death. Today, that's ecocide, right? That's what we're doing. So we are, because we're not facing our inner demons, because we're focused on outer work instead of the inner work, we are in effect behaving like a drug addict. Once again, that's the theory I'm proposing today. So I've had the experience of living with an addict in my house for almost a year. It's a very difficult experience. And those of you who heard me in July know my wife is a mental health nurse. So a lot of this comes from my personal experience from living with addicts, supporting treatment centers, going to presentations, and the ideas from my wife. Addicts can't face their weaknesses. And by the way, as I hear this, think about the world out there in the news. I talk to you about what people like DeSantis are doing. It destroys relationships by betraying trust. You end up totally alone. Addicts have stopped believing in themselves. They don't have any sense of self-worth. They are filled with self-loathing. But they are in tremendous pain and seek relief from that pain through the addiction. And so the addiction is a result of the pain. They only heal when they hit rock bottom, and they only heal when they stop blaming others and can look within. So part of today's proposal is that this is the world we live in. This isn't just the drug addicts like the guy pictured here. This is our society at large. And so we need to treat ourselves and understand that to begin the healing so that we can, when we try to do something, it will actually work, understanding where we in our society is at. I'm going to leave you with this poem. I would like you to read this out loud if you can. It's probably St. Francis's most famous, well, it's probably his second most famous poem. It's called Canticle of the Creatures. And I want you to read it with the understanding that he really saw that all of us are creatures because we are created beings. We are all life, human and non-human, are of equal value in his light. So I'm going to give you a minute to read that. If you can read it out loud, even better. I hope you've had enough time to read the Pat. It's only a part of the poem, by the way. So now we're at the journey. So once again, the Franciscan approach, I'm hoping, is one path for people from the sort of capitalist industrial culture to become Indigenous, and particularly I would say become Indigenous again. We once were, and now we're kind of returning home in a way. So when I say Indigenous, I mean it very much in a generic sense. For example, it means that the health of our ecosystem is central to our culture. It means land is our life. And this gives us the responsibility to care for all life as it is. That means it's not because it's a resource that makes us better, because the land itself has equal value in and of itself, which is, by the way, what Gray Owl wrote about, that the forest as a forest, even before it's chopped down, has intrinsic value in and of itself, that we live with the land and not off the land. So that's how I'm looking at Indigenous in that kind of a way. It has very much to do with relationship and not being alone. We exist not as an I, it in Buber's term, but an I, thou. We are together, have this relationship, and the relationship is everything. In Buddhism, they would say we don't really have feelings, our feelings have us. Okay? So I'm going to say how these ideas are very much Indigenous in nature. And St. Francis would say we don't own stuff, stuff owns us. So if you see the logic here and how it relates to the third bullet, which is an Indigenous perspective, is we don't own land, the land owns us. So that switch inside between owning land and the land owning us, or we don't own stuff, the stuff owns us, that inner click is what we're exploring today as a necessary part of our attempts to stop the destruction of our ecosystem. Said in a similar way, this is from somebody called Vine Deloria, who is a Standing Rock Sioux in the US. He says the same thing, and these are his words: somewhere in our planetary history, religious expression changed from participation in the sound, color, and rhythm of nature to the abstraction of man outside this context. So we just need to return home. We're not inventing something new. We just went out, we learned a lot. We've learned an awful lot, and we've learned through our mistakes, which is fine. But we have to admit to those mistakes and return with the knowledge that we've had of the last couple thousand years of civilization. In this Indigenous perspective, there's this idea of limits. Now, in the Club of Rome, where limits is part of our obsession. And so to be Indigenous in the way that I'm proposing is that we're connected to the earth, and therefore we are automatically self-limiting, because all the other beings that we rely upon to live have value in and of themselves, and we need them to survive as well. These limits, though, begin with understanding our limits inside. It's the inner journey which allows us to do that. And I propose once we adopt this Indigenous ethos, we will be able to live within our limits. It won't even be that hard once we make that inner click. I would say in Canada, this journey has it's more, people are more aware of this, certainly as a question, given all the Indigenous issues that are in the news. And I can see that being very, very helpful within the Canadian cultural context. Another poem for you to read. This is one of my favorite poets. She's an American lady called Mary Oliver. She spent most of her life living on Cape Cod, and this is one of her most famous poems. I'm going to let you read the poem again, and this, if you get what she's talking about, this is us returning to this connection and being part and one with each other and having this relationship of I, thou with the world around us. So once again, I'm going to give you a minute plus to read the poem. And if you can read it out loud, even better. I hope you enjoyed that poem, and you can find her poems online. She's a great poet. All right, part 4. So how do we turn this idea in reality and make it actionable? And why is this in the real world? How is this helpful? Well, there are things like fires going on all around the world right now, and there's a lot of people grieving, a lot of people pain and suffering and like in shock and don't know how to deal with this. If you can imagine, this is your home and your whole life is gone. So this is deep set grief. It's a kind of grief called solastalgia. However, so it's not just a grief of a dear one dying, it's a grief of your entire world. Imagine not just your belongings, but imagine your forest gone as well, your job, your career, everything gone. That's the kind of grief that we're talking about with what's coming our way. However, there is the possibility for growth through the pain. The pain isn't avoidable, but how we react to it is a choice when we do inner work. There's a famous quote, comes from my wife. She says, trauma is not what happens to you. Trauma is how you respond. So the trauma's inner psychologically happens through how you react to these external events of which most of the time you have no control. So this is the traditional 7 stages of grief. Because this is going to happen, people who have done the inner work and can work in this interior journey have a much better chance of turning what could be PTSD, post-traumatic stress, into what's called post-traumatic growth. And that's why I firmly believe that this interior psychological work is essential, because these kind of ecological grief events are happening and will accelerate. Put another way, by Stephen Jenkinson, to explain and understand why most of the time are succumbing to either denial or doomerism. It's really understandable, because going into this inner journey, which is called often the dark night of the soul, is frankly not pleasant. It hurts, but it gives you hope. So he says the following: inattention to the world's ecological state is well advised, because attention to it mitigates your happiness, your contentment, and your sense of well-being. Having a conscience is now a grief-soaked proposition. Whatever spiritual awakening may have mentioned the past and places, if you awaken in our time, you awaken with a sob. In Franciscan terms, what we call that is that the path of descent, of going down into this, is actually necessary for the ascent. So to go up, you go down to go up. There's a very famous Franciscan monk called Richard Rohr, who I read every day, who explores this kind of state of being and how you can cope with this and not crack and not deny and not be filled with despair. So the term that we're looking for and hoping for is post-traumatic growth, and that's growth after trauma. We can't avoid trauma. There's all sorts of things we can't do, but we can control our response. This is a minority of the population is able to do that, but with work, we can do that. So we know from research. By the way, the links are in the notes. Everything I have has links, which if you download the slideshow, you can see that in the notes page. People who endure psychological struggle following adversity can see positive growth afterwards. And that's what we're working towards. People develop new understandings of themselves and the world, how to relate to other people, and the kind of future they might have. And that's the goal as we take this journey and go through our experiences and as we become Indigenous. So I'm hoping that this will increase the chances of this growth. I've been reading this particular Cree writer recently. He got the Massey Lecture and gave a series of talks on CBC last year. His name is Thompson Highway. I've chosen him because I'm reading him, and he's a great Canadian person and writer. He lives, by the way, in Gatineau right now. And he wrote a an autobiography, which is, as he says, full of beautiful exaggerations. And he has the following to give us the sense of wonder, because he explains the wonder of being alive and also the harshness. I mean, his life was really hard. You know, for example, half of his siblings died because of the environment where they were. There was no medical care, no nothing. And yet he never in his writings feels sorry and bad, because he's able to go through it and say, wow, being alive is amazing. And here's what he says in one of his books, said, there 10 trillion miles into the night hang 10 trillion stars, the only sound that of paddles dipping into Reindeer Lake, the water swirling. And there in the water all around, stretching out to infinity, is the exact same dome of 10 trillion stars, a perfect reflection of the sky above. So, in conclusion, by the way, John, how am I doing for time?
You've got about 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Awesome. Perfect. Thank you. So in conclusion, the theory I'm proposing about belief that for you to mull over is that we are entering the dark night of the soul, classic term, the descent before the ascent, and that to survive, we must see that as a path not of doom, not of despair, not of denial, but the way we transform. To make that possible so that we don't succumb to post-traumatic stress, but instead of increase our odds of post-traumatic growth, we need to work on our inner world so that we have a hope of being strong enough and courageous enough to deal with our outer problems. In that journey, there's a lot of acceptance, grief, and they are necessary for this transformation. By the way, that's a picture of idealized of Francis with a wolf. There's a myth about him with taming and becoming friends with a wolf, which we don't have time for, but it's a great story. When we do that, we have to recognize that both denial and doom only ensure despair and death. That our desecration of the outer world is actually a reflection of our self-loathing, that we are addicts, we are addicted to growth, but we must forgive ourselves to heal and transform. That St. Francis and his path is one way and has some ideas that can help all of us transform from a me-centered to a life-centered, all of the worldview. And it is possible for us in this cultural sort of trauma to return home and become Indigenous again, and to be reconnected in a deep way with each other and the land. I'm going to leave you with this poem. Wendell Berry is a writer in the US who lives in rural Kentucky. He was just about to become a rock star writer and poet in the turbulent 60s in New York. And he said, you know what? I'm just going to spend my life writing in Kentucky. And this is one of his poems. He was taught, I learned about him from one of my daughters, actually. He's a very Christian writer, but Christian in the generic sense, not in the pound you over the head with the 2x4 sense of the word. The idea that all of us, as I do unto others, so will it be done unto me. The way I treat others is how I get treated. It's called the Mad Farmer's Manifesto. Once again, this is only an excerpt from it. It's much longer. And I'm going to give you a minute once again. And once again, if you are able to read it out loud, all the better. I hope you had enough time for that. And of course, if you're curious, you can just Google Mad Farmer's Manifesto and get the whole poem. So we're done for today. I want to leave this last quote by one of my favorite writers. This is a Canadian doctor called Gabor Mate. Here's his latest book, which I'm reading. He is a specialist in trauma and addiction. And he says the following: it's not the world, not what's outside of us, but what we hold inside that traps us. And now it's time for questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gordon. I would like to, as the tradition allows me to do, ask the first question, but I'd like to put two people on notice that they're coming up. Peter Volkowski is the one with the first question, and on deck will be Art. Gordon, I tried to do some very disorganized reading to get a better feel for St. Francis. And of course, I soon came across the Pope himself, who at a certain point noticed that there was a great environmental consciousness coming over the world. And after that, I lost track of everything I read, and I think he did refer to St. Francis in some of the things he said, the Pope that is, but I did notice that St. Francis really was very much tied in with all the animal life. So my question, I guess, has to do with did you come across St. Francis during the period that the Pope mentioned, that is to say, a great livening of consciousness of the environment? And was there some world, something happening in the world that
not to me. So John, not to me. For me, it was very simple. I got really sick. I was fine one day. The next thing I knew, I was in the hospital, and they said, we don't know if you're going to make it. And I was staring at the ceiling for 2 weeks, and I couldn't walk more than 20 steps for 2 years. So I had a lot of time on my hands.
Wow.
And through that time, that inner grief, very much of a grieving for, life was not going to be what it was. I saw a grief counselor, and I said, what matters? To me, what matters? And in that journey, I happened to come across actually a professor talking about St. Francis, which I shared with my children as I drove them to school every day. And that began it. So it was very much of an interior crisis. Out of that, I also then joined shortly thereafter the Club of Rome as an external expression of with the same goal, different way of getting there. the inner and the outer journeys. So what you heard today is very much me, but there's a lot of people like me. This isn't just, there's a collective. It turns out that Francis is by far the most popular saint in the world. There are almost 500,000 Franciscans. The Pope is named Francis because of that. He's the patron saint of the environment. I'm not Catholic, by the way. So there are non-Catholic Franciscans, which is very odd. There are many, many women who are Franciscans, third order. In my particular version of Franciscan, I'd say about 60% of its members are women. Many of them also indigenous in South America. I was just at a retreat in Phoenix. That's why I mentioned I was in Phoenix, where we had people from all over the Caribbean and South America as well in that. So that's my particular journey. This is just what happened with me, and as a proposal that there's maybe something, a little tidbit in here that will scratch somebody's curiosity, okay? That's the most I'm hoping for, and I would be thrilled if it just said, maybe I might be curious about this little bit of what Gord blathered about.
Okay, there are 4 people on the question list, which is good, but we will want some more. A quick follow-up, third order. Do you start with the first order and then second order?
The first order means you're a monk. The second order means you're a nun. And the third order means you're anybody else, right?
I see.
So anybody, and that was set up at around 1220, like a long time ago. When Francis was alive, he set that up. So it's to follow, and what that means to be a Franciscan, whether you're a monk, nun, or third order, is you write a rule. So you have certain guiding principles which you follow. For example, to live as simply as is reasonable within your constraints as a regular, father and worker and everything. So you give these principles, but as a third order person, you write your own rule. So it's a rule of life, which is like a guiding template and a touchstone to keep you, like you could say, psychically strong, so that you don't crack. It's to avoid despair and trauma. It's like an inner discipline, and there are many other paths that have a similar goal, by the way. And I'm not saying this is the only path. It absolutely is not. There are different ways, but always this inner journey is very helpful when you deal with the outer challenges. Some form of that.
Okay, good, thank you. Peter Belkowski, with art on deck, and after that will be David, not David Doherty. You're next after that. So Peter Belkowski with art on deck, please.
Gordon, many of us have difficult thoughts these days, or more towards your terminology, a dark night of the soul, with regard to the 5th attempt in a century and a half to eliminate Ukrainian society. We have the Putins and the Wagners deep in our thoughts. How do we move out from that, where the external seems not to be of the question of preserving the ecosphere, but of saving ourselves from those who would murder?
Why don't you give me an easy question, Peter? Like, like something that this exploration today has to really go there would take too long. I recognize there are these external things. I would say the following. I'll give you a parable, okay? That's a very traditional response. So I had a preacher once, an assistant preacher. He was driving down in Ottawa, driving down the, I think, Riverside one day, and somebody cut him off. Some bad person cut him off. He had to slam on the brakes, almost went through the windshield, and he was just about to give him the salute. I'm sure, Peter, you're familiar with the salute. And he went, whoa, I'm not going to do that today because what that's going to do is wreck my day. And I'm instead going to pray for him. And, maybe he just had a bad day. Maybe his teenage daughter just told him that she's pregnant. We don't know. Maybe he just got fired. Got some, maybe he could be just a jerk. That's possible, but you don't know. The internal journey of interior dialogue of others is a very mysterious thing. And so the best thing we can do is not be reactive and to keep our own composure and somehow give some minimal benefit of a doubt so that we don't destroy ourselves. So very often when we project the evil and say, this is, Putin is an evil megalomaniac who needs, the best thing that could happen is somebody assassinates him, that infiltrates us and distorts us. So we have to be very, very careful of that. And the judgment is a very dubious thing. I have, my family, by the way, came from Eastern Europe. My name is Czech, so I'm of Czech heritage. My family fled the communists. In a similar way, my mother's German, they fled the communists. My daughter married somebody from Romania who fled the communists. So I'm no fan of the Russians and what they've done with communism in particular, and the sort of very, very heavy-handed approach that they've employed, which have not made a lot of friends. But nonetheless, I don't see it as helpful to demonize. It's how do you de-escalate and bring us to sanity? Is it very, very difficult? Absolutely. Is it what's going on terrible? Absolutely. But the first step is equanimity within. Maybe I'll give you a story from the last presentation because I'm not sure that's not adequate for you, Peter. But once again, I'm sticking today into this interior thing as a first baby step. Story I told in the last presentation. Were you here for the last talk, Peter, that my wife and I gave?
Yes.
Okay. Do you remember the story about the smart car and how I couldn't convince the guy to give me the $1,000 for the smart car?
Yeah.
No, I don't recall
Yeah.
that.
Okay. So I parked a car, the engine, I got told by the mechanic, the engine's dead. I said, okay, fine. And then it got parked. There was a snowstorm. The guy he hired to park it destroyed my car with the snowplow. And I said, okay, you destroyed my car. I look on Kijiji, it's worth $1,000, big deal. He won't pay me. He said, well, it's your own, the car's worth nothing. It was your fault, blah, blah, blah. And I was all like, you're wrong, I'm right. How can you be such a jerk? You are a bad person. It just didn't, it wasn't effective. Like it just didn't work, right? My wife comes along with her de-escalation, the right tone of voice, working on this inner work, being compassionate in a sensible, pragmatic way, chats with him for 20 minutes. I have a check for $1,000. Poof, done. I just don't see that confrontational approach as effective. That's all. Doesn't work, right? The more you put people in a corner like reaction, the more you tell them what they can't do, the more they're going to tell you to fudge off. That's just how people are. So every time we do what we're doing, the chances of nuclear war just go up. Right?
Okay, well, thank
I'm
you.
not saying the what, I'm saying the how.
Thank you for the analogy and for your answer.
Thank you, Peter.
The next on deck is Art with David Pollock with a comment, and I would mention, speaking of David Pollock, he has put out a call for new members on the board. In case some of you have not looked at the chat function, and David is the first there. So Art is next, and with David Pollock on deck.
Okay, I guess most people know that I have spent most of my life being a massive contributor to the amount of carbon dioxide in the environment. I traveled the globe, did all the things which were considered absolutely normal and acceptable through the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. And since then, of course, people also know that I've transformed into saying I'm going to electrify everything. I'm going to address energy in a major way, and focus much of my remaining years to electrifying everything and getting off fossil fuels. This is partially to address, some very deep guilt feelings of being such a contributor to this, and to the point, of course, where I have no interest in traveling anymore or going anywhere. And in this case, my wife is going to England later this month, and I'm not, because I don't want to contribute to more guilt. That I am, in fact, contributing more to the present state of affairs, that other people are suffering and dying from it, from some of the actions that I've taken earlier in my life. How do you manage to live with this lack of guilt? I mean, you went down to Phoenix and attended this conference, and you travel about as well. How do you address this sense of guilt, or how should I address my sense of guilt?
Tough one. Before I answer that, I didn't fly for 20 years. And then I had a daughter that moved to British Columbia, two daughters that moved to BC, and that's been a big problem. The Phoenix flight was the first non-family flight since the year 2000. I wasn't going to go, and they desperately said, you're a co-presenter, because I said, we want you to present there. And I said, well, I'll present on Zoom. And then they said, no, we really want you to come, and we're going to pay for your ticket. And they said, you want me that badly that you're going to do that? At that point, it would have been really insulting, so that's what happened. Okay, so there's these, we muddle through, we're imperfect. Forgiveness is required. You need to do the best you can. I've done like Art. I have only electric cars. I have solar panels. I have geothermal. He's got a much fancier control system. I don't have Tesla batteries, but I've gone as totally electric as possible for the last sort of 10, 15 years. My vacations are, I go to the cottage, drive my electric car to the cottage, which is fully electric. So you do the best you really have to do the best you can and not beat yourself up. You got to say, in my soul, for where I'm at in my life and my limitations, because we're all limited beings, what are the limits to what I can do is the best I can do, recognizing it that will always be imperfect, and not beat yourself up. Secondly, what you've done in that is you have a gift. You have some gifts. You have some capabilities. So you have some things that you are now contributing back. You didn't mention that, but we all know you are contributing back to the city, the community, to other people, big time, saying, I have this gift, and a gift is worthless if it just sits here. It has to be shared and returned. Like there's this reciprocity, which I know you're doing, Art. And this reciprocity, which you're doing, you received and now you're giving back, is the essential, what Martin Buber calls I thou. This is this constant giving and taking and giving and taking, knowing within your limitations, because we're all limited. And knowing, what I'm curious, Art, is what sort of catharsis happened to you to go from, hey, society said this is normal, this is fine, to what you're doing now. Like, it's quite a radical shift. So what happened inside you to do that, Art? So I'm putting you back on the spot.
Yeah, interesting question.
Yeah.
I've never really thought about that, but I think it was primarily guilt. that I had been
Yeah.
such a major contributor.
How did you
And
not fall? How did you not succumb to self-loathing? If you felt guilt, and I know the feeling, and you say, you know, I'm a poop head, and you know, maybe I'm a bad person, but how did you not to succumb to that self-defeating, non-helpful attitude? How did you transform that guilt into something positive?
I never started loathing myself. I says, here's a problem. Here's what I can do. I've got certain skills. I got understanding, and I can do something. And I'm going to show, I'm going to show people who are telling me it's impossible. I can't do that. And I said, well, of course, I'll show you it can be done.
Well, that was the opening meditation. You did do the opening meditation, isn't you? You're going to show what people say is impossible. Gosh darn it, I'm going to do it. Just because they say that, right?
Yeah, I'm going to do it behind your back, and then I'll show you.
Well, there's something inside you that made you tick, which I would say you're in a minority position where most people succumb to post-traumatic stress. You did it as post-traumatic growth. For some reason, something inside your being helped you to be able to do that. Okay, but that's surprisingly difficult and rare. It really is.
Well, geez, you turned this into a wonderful compliment. Oh my,
Absolutely.
I'm embarrassed now. Anyway, next question, John. I got to get out of here.
I just think something happened interior. There's an interior life event that happened, whatever the heck that is. Okay.
Just remember, Gordon, take it easy on the praise with Art, otherwise you'll find he gets really he gets really out of control. Anyway,
Okay.
David Pollock, your question.
Thank you, John.
David Doherty is on deck.
Thank you, John. I wonder, would someone turn my video back on?
I think Art can do that.
I'll come and get you. Hold on. But anyway, why don't you go ahead and I'll get there.
Okay, sure. It's not terribly important. It's on, I guess. Gordon, thank you very much for the kind of preparation that you've done and the slides I enjoyed and the whole presentation. I'm relieved that you've advised us what the definition of the third order Franciscan is. I was afraid that I'm just starting my.
There's the camera. We saw the top of your forehead for a second.
He is there.
There we go.
Right.
Thanks. I was afraid, Gordon, that you were on your way trying to work your way into a black belt. When I saw the third order, I wasn't quite sure of what it designated. So thanks for that explanation.
You're welcome.
I was going to say that you made me think of several things as you were doing your presentation. I've been an admirer for years. I mean, up until the time of his death, and I suppose it still
David,
continues.
I'm going to interrupt you. Why don't you aim the camera so we see your face instead of your forehead? Even though it's a very beautiful forehead.
How's that, Gordon?
Wonderful.
That's as good as it's going to get, by the way. I was going to say one of the people I admired was Bishop Tutu.
Yeah.
And at one point, I remember him saying that every single day, he found himself crying over some part of existence of the world, of something that was going on in the world. And he said, and every single day, he found something to smile and laugh about.
Yeah.
And I thought it was an interesting designation of somebody walking a kind of middle way. And I've kind of appropriated this, and I ask myself, usually, not every day, but most days, I ask myself, have I or what have I cried about today? And I ask myself, what have I found joy or laughed about today? And the one I've added is, have I spent any time in nature today? Which is an important ingredient for me. And I'm pleased to share with you, I've relaunched my rowboat out on the Rideau River, having spent all winter varnishing it. But I know, I wanted to say that there were two comments about the presentation, sort of caveats in a way. I used to work in the international development field with CUSO, for a number of years. And when you talk about St. Francis being attracted to poverty, I think it's always really important to stress the fact that this is voluntary poverty. You made the point he came from wealth.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And I find that there are those people that sort of praise poverty as an absolute. And of
Yeah.
course, those who are really in poverty find it a desperately awful, terrifying,
I would call
death-bringing
that, I would call that
condition.
destitution. He's not talking about destitution.
Absolutely not. But I just
No.
wanted to say it's voluntary poverty that he found rewarding for himself. And the other was just the comment about science being a kind of belief. It takes quite a long conversation. Of course, I understand what you're saying, I think, but in most circles, science is something that stands in contrast to belief, of course. And regardless of my belief, I want to stress the fact that if I say I'm going to turn a cup of water upside down, that it will fall out. And that's much more than my belief, because that will happen regardless of my belief. And there's something in this age of science deniers that I want to preserve in terms of the value of science, even though I understand you stating it as a system of belief. So that was my comment.
Once again, if you think of the picture I had between the two devils and the two extremes of denial and doom or despair, it's really this knife edge, this fine line that we're walking, which is extremely dangerous. So just the 2 points you've raised, we could explore, and we know each other, well. We've even, by the way, audience, we've even gone camping together. I went camping with this guy in May in Algonquin Park, thinking he was slightly crazy, and it worked out to be amazing and brilliant, right? But yeah, these are dangerous things and dangerous words, but everything of value is dangerous. And so life is, by definition, to be alive is dangerous. And yeah, so we're exploring things that can be misconstrued and abused and misinterpreted very, very easily. I absolutely admit to that. The audience should know that I'm a professional engineer, so I have been trained well in the scientific method and don't poo-hoo science in any way, but I do recognize its limitations as we try to bring people along. Because the question I'm raising isn't just about me and you, it's about our society and our world. It's about us as a collective, as a social animal, cooperating and trusting each other to do this together. So this is nothing to do with individualism. I mean, it's a very almost anti-individualistic ethos I'm talking about, of relationship, where the relationship is more important than you or me. So there's all of these built-in, I'd say, safeguards to avoid the excesses that you mentioned, David. Thank you.
David Doherty, you're next for a question, and Samrat, you're on deck.
Thank you, John. Thank you for the presentation today, Gordon. I was really thinking carefully about what you were saying about doomerism. I'm not sure whether I think I am myself a doomer, but others probably would label me as that. And I'm just wondering, is your definition of doomerism accurate? I recognize that there are things that I can do, and I can do things to enjoy my life, but also that this is insufficient. And I'm sure not to invest in the false hope that others who have much more power than I are going to act, since they are clearly
They're not going to. They're not going to.
Yeah, they're clearly not doing what's needed. And
No.
I'm left with the feeling that we likely are doomed. I don't intend to get depressed about it. I'm going to carry on with my life. I'm going to do everything that I can, but I'm still left with, yeah, we're doomed.
I want to make a fine hair-splitting difference between, we heard a presentation a few months ago about collapse acceptance and doomerism. To me, they're very, very different things. Is the world as we know it, I use the word acceptance and loss and grief again and again, is the world as we know it going to change, collapse? Probably. I'm not going to say for certain, but probably. But that does not mean doom. Okay, that's not, I'm not equating the two at all, because there's transformation and something else next, something different. I might not like it. No, but in that process, is there pain? Absolutely. Is there grief? Is there loss? Is there bad things? Absolutely. But that's not doom. That is still not doom. That is an acceptance and a loss and a grieving and a recognition that I can only do so much, and to know that I'm limited and there's things I just can't do. But that frees a space for whatever is next to happen, right? And which I don't know what that is. I have to leave that as a mystery, but I leave open the potential, because I'm not God. I am not a know-it-all. To presume that, you know, I know, or even I have a remote clue, is, I'd say, delusional and arrogant in the extreme. So I leave the door as there's a potential there, which I do not understand, something beyond reason. Whatever that is, it's the unknowable unknowns. So I'm a believer in the unknowable unknowns. But yes, so collapse acceptance is not doomerism. There is, for me, a significant difference. By the way, it's a very different young person, old person, okay? To talk about, I think, doom and use those words when you're old and you have a sense of your own death, you can see that, you know what? I have X number of years on this world before it's bye-bye for me. If you're talking to a 20-something-year-old, that's a completely different ballgame, or a teenager. That is just going to fill them with despair and suicide and no relationships, and they don't have girlfriends or boyfriends or kids or anything. And their life is, it's just pretty revolting. You know, because I'm a teacher. I spent most of my life being a high school teacher. You have to, those words and how you express them are also dependent upon where we are each at in our life journey, right? So those things all matter. So I know what you're saying, but I think I'm not being somebody who's filled with hope in a delusional way. I don't accuse myself of that, but this little nuance in the way I'm presenting to you today, consider that and reflect upon that as a possibility. Because I'm not certain either. Of course I'm not, right? But it's worked for me. I've gone on a lot of climate strikes and met a lot of really depressed people, okay? I've been with a lot of activists who are just plain depressed. And I'm like, whoa, that didn't work out well. Good people who mean well. And they didn't do they were focused on the outer world, and they didn't do the grief counseling, because there's massive grieving and that's very, very difficult, by the way. It hurts quite a lot. I'm just surprised that it didn't hurt Art, but okay, Art is Art. He's a different person. You know, he has his way of doing that. I understand your point, David. Just consider this as a possibility.
Yeah, I appreciate what you said. I will offer this little tidbit. I decided quite some time ago that the appropriate response for me is to have grim determination to get things done that I can do. I don't have the power to control, you know, the premier of the province or the prime minister or the, you know, prime minister of Britain, who now seems intent on putting out an enormous bunch of contracts for BP to get more fossil fuels out of the North Sea. It's just dumb. Yeah. And I can't do anything about it. But I have grim determination to get what I can done. That's why I wrote the book, Do Yourself a Favor, Live Lightly, Live Better. It's why I'm in the midst of writing the Great Depression series. I'm about halfway through the third book. And, you know, it's the way that it's in a way, it links back to what you said about how young people are going to feel, because the main character is a very young person.
Yeah. And that is your journey. And there's no way I could possibly presume that your journey is not appropriate to you, as long as you're not stuck and you're still living, like you're living, you're struggling inside and outside, that means you're still alive. That I cannot presume that that is good or bad or anything. I can't possibly judge that. That would just be absurd. I want to leave you a quote for Friedrich Nietzsche. So my son-in-law sent this to me this morning, and since we have time, and I want to read it. Now, he's accused of being an atheist and, you know, God is dead and all that stuff, all right? But he says the following as a response to the word grim determination. He says the following: I want to learn more and more to see as beautiful what is necessary in all things. Then I shall be one of those who makes things beautiful. Let that be my love. I do not want to wage war against what is ugly. I do not want to accuse. I do not even want to accuse those of accuse. Looking away will be my only negation. And all in all, on the whole, someday I wish to only be a yes sayer. And this is the guy who said, famously, God is dead. You know, he's affirming life, no matter what. While you're alive, you can say grim determination. And if that works for you, go for it. I would prefer more the way Friedrich Nietzsche says it, but that's okay. I think I congratulate you on everything you are doing and living out. Well done.
Samrat, you are your question now, please, and then Janet Strickler is on deck.
Hey, hi, Gordon. That's
Hi
an
there.
amazing
Great to see you
presentation.
again. Great to see you again, Samrat.
Yeah, it's an amazing presentation, especially for even the CACOR presentation. Very, very different. And my question is quite simple, actually, if you understand it. Early on in your presentation, you used something that one can become or go towards the indigenous. Yeah? If you remember, it was your second slide.
Yeah. That's sort of that's where I think we need to go culturally and how we relate to each other and the natural world.
Right. So it's very good because I've been hearing similar things from other writers as well. Now, my question is that a person like me, and there are millions like me who were born in a completely urban setup here, how do we become indigenous? Or what do you mean by it?
What I mean is, first of all, certainly I can only speak from, you know, my little slice of experiences, is that rather than a focus, first of all, on me and everything else is sort of a thing relative to me, I focus on the us and how everything out there, every other person, every other live being has as much value as I do, and I focus on the relationship. So rather than being like, say, David said, this is what I do, it's about us. So I go out of my way to be social now, which post-COVID is actually surprisingly difficult. I go out of my way to be with people who are different, who are at a different socioeconomic, and make a relationship. I very consciously and deliberately go in nature as another being. You know, when I happen to have a cottage in Quebec, which I inherited. I was lucky enough to inherit that. And when I'm there and I just hear the loon, and there's this, I'm part of this bigger story. It's healing, it's solving, it reduces my anxiety, my anger, and all of that. So it's about making conscious connections with all other life. And that's what I mean by being indigenous. I'm only talking about the interior journey today. That's all that's only the slice that I'm doing. But I'm saying that allows you, sort of like Art said, he had that realization of grief and went, oh my gosh, what do I do with this? And then he did stuff. And it's the power going into your interior, what your relationships are, gives you this power to try to do what people say, well, you can't do that. That's not possible. And then you try to do it. And you may succeed, you may not, you may fail. That's besides the point. So
okay, thanks so much. So I have it clear, I'm not going to take up more time, is that so one doesn't need to move closer to nature only. one needs to feel it from within as well.
No. But where you said you lived in Spain, is that correct?
Yeah, but I live in an industrial base here, it's not a big
Yeah.
city, but
Yeah.
I don't have much nature around me. Well, I do according to European standards.
Do you have a balcony where you could plant some flowers?
I have. I
Great.
have a balcony and I have plants and I like watching them and watering them.
Great. Do you have sprouts? Do you have a goldfish, a dog or a cat? Or is there a place you can go?
Yeah, we'll have another conversation. I'm sure other people want to have conversations.
All of us are in a different space. Like in the third order, we all write our own rule.
Right.
So whatever I say is no way going to ever directly apply to you. It's just impossible. You're in a different phase. But the questions rather than the answers. I just hope today is questions, and you're asking great questions. And so if you ask different questions, you're going to get a different answer, right? So I'm just giving you the questions in effect, okay? And I think you're taking it that way, and I am appreciating that you're doing it like that.
Yeah,
right?
Thanks so much.
And by the way, in general, I've enjoyed our email conversations. They've been
absolutely, me too. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Thank
thanks
you,
so
Sam.
much. All right.
Okay, Janet Strickler, your question. And the last one on the list, I think, so far, is Mike Nickerson. So Mike, you're on deck, and Janet, the floor is yours.
Hey, it's great to see you, Janet. This is awesome.
Good to see you too, Gordon. I am one of Gordon's Franciscan sisters down in Colorado in the United States. So thank you for this wonderful presentation. I really especially enjoyed the poetry. So I love it that you included poetry. If anybody's interested, I put a link in the chat to Laudato Si, which is Pope Francis's letter to the world about the environment and our responsibility to understand all creatures, including humans and non-humans, as our kin, and at the level of understanding that is possible for a pope to have at that point. But it's a beautiful document that was really intended not just for Catholics, not just for Christians, but for everyone in the world. And I don't really have a question exactly. I just grateful that there's people out there thinking about this stuff on the various levels of, the scientific and informational level, but also on the level of our interior life and how that affects our behavior, because I think that's where change can come from. So thank
Together, because Janet and I, by the way, Janet was in Phoenix with me, and it was wonderful. She gave a really earthy presentation about mending, and she included a picture of my blue jeans, which my 93-year-old mother has put patches on for the last 20 years as an example of a Franciscan ethos, because Francis had supposedly one cloak, which was mostly patches, because he didn't want stuff to own him. And so she used my jeans as a metaphor in her presentation about mending, not just clothing, but our souls and the world, and that the imperfections that we all have are the gift itself, because we're all mending ourselves and each other and the world. So this is not a bad thing, it's kind of a gift. And that's what she did, a presentation on that, which was really wonderful, Janet.
Thank you, Gordon.
It was really great.
And I too have thought a lot about how to become Indigenous in an urban setting. My setting isn't quite as urban as some, but not as non-urban as yours, Gordon. And the one thing I've discovered in thinking about that for a long time is that wherever you are, there is nature. We are nature.
Yeah. And that
is that it's so easy for humans to think of ourselves as distinct from even the word environment. I've now become kind of sensitive to that word because it implies something outside of us. where really we're part of us, the big us. And so wherever we live, even if that's in the middle of a concrete jungle, we are still part of this whole thing that is the world. And the more we can get in touch with our place where we are, where I live, I'm close to the Rocky Mountains. People think, I'm going to go outside and be in nature. And they drive half an hour so that they're up in the mountains and surrounded by wilderness. And that's beautiful. But right outside my door, there are birds and grass and so on. But also, I can be connected through what do I eat and where does that come from? What do I buy and where does that come from? Those things are, anything I consume is coming from the earth.
Yeah, yeah.
And so becoming conscious of that and acknowledging our relationship with the farmers and the soil and the sunshine and the seeds that made the food that we buy at the grocery store, and all the whole chain of everything that brings that to us, all the people in between, all the structures in between and so on, is a way of, I would say that's a way of becoming Indigenous.
Yeah, no, I agree. By the way, you're hearing what I'm saying in a different way from another Franciscan. A key word I want to point out that Janet used is connection. It's not isolated. It's always connected, and the emphasis is on the connection and the relationship. And that's what Janet, I think, was talking about. And so now, yeah, so thank you very much for complimenting and adding another dimension to what I was saying, Janet. And all the best in Colorado. I hope the fires aren't too bad. Are they out of control in Colorado?
This has been a very unusual year here. We have had very few forest fires because we've had a tremendous amount of rain, and that is very unusual here. Yeah. So we're having a little break from the new normal, and I'm trying to remind myself that this is not going back to we're not going back to the way it was 60 years ago when I was a child, or 50 and 60 years ago. We're just having a little break from the new normal, but this year actually has been remarkably green. So I volunteer collecting native seeds on the public open space lands so that we have a seed bank to use for restoration after things like fires and floods and so on. And boy, we've been collecting seeds like mad this year. So we're building up our reserves to help with resilience for what we know will be back. The next year probably will be like last year.
We're going to give you a gift back from the Club of Rome. One of our members mentioned before we started that there is no new normal. There's not going to be any normal at all. Like every year is going to be, whoa, whoops, where'd that come from? So we've stopped using the word normal. It doesn't apply anymore.
That's an excellent thought. Thank you.
Two last questions. Mike Nickerson, a quick question, and Lalit, a quick comment.
Okay, well, thank you, Gordon, for your presentation. It's a delight to see the Club of Rome starting to look interiorly. There's been such a lot of attention to the material world and what we can do to straighten that out. But as you know, I'm very keen on looking at what we can do interior. The idea that we can no longer have everything that we want, but that we can be more than we ever imagined is indicative of that. And I'm just wondering if you would agree that the idea of more fun, less stuff, it runs in parallel with what you've been saying.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a slice. I really love I think it's from India, the picture of the wise men holding different parts of the elephant and say, this is a trunk and this is a skin and this is a tusk. And I'm just one blind man touching a part of the elephant. And I'm sad to report, Mike, that you're another blind man holding a different part of the elephant, and your part of the elephant is valid. And so it's another part of this big story, part of it, of the sort of dematerialization, the self-obsession, narcissism of self and separation. So it's another thread. And I congratulate you on everything you are doing together, the two of you. By the way, any Club of Rome members who live around Ottawa, Mike lives out towards Lanark. It's a great place to visit. I would strongly recommend visiting them and just having a very, I'm not sure the right word, a good experience for whatever that is, for sure, a good experience. Thank you.
Thank
very
you, Gordon. Yeah.
The last question, Lalit, you are on now, please.
Thank you, Jan. Gordon, well, I've got some technology making a lot of noise here, cutting a lawn here, so I hope you can hear me properly. Gordon, that was amazing. I'm always been a proponent of the interior work too. And simply for me going Indigenous, I can do it from this place here. I can go under a tree here. And when I teach kids meditation, I take them through a very simple exercise. I tell them, okay, focus on your breath. As you're sitting there, as you focus on your breath, you forget the material past and the material future. You become present to the here and now. And then I guide them and I ask them to inquire into where this breath is coming from. And it's coming from a tree, coming from the soil, coming from the ocean. And then where is my out breath going to? It's going to the tree. So our symbiotic relationship, the Indigenous relationship, is here as we are sitting right now. And talking about Mike, yes, Mike, you both are walking the talk out in Lanark. I've had the pleasure of hanging out with you too. So Gordon, I also want to connect with you again to have a deeper conversation about all this. So thank you for bringing this to the surface.
Thank you very much, Lalit. And once again, for the audience, notice when he was talking about meditation, it wasn't in an escape and isolating from the worries of the world. He talked about how it connects. It's all about connection. So when I'm talking about Indigenous, I'm talking about connection. Franciscan is connection and not isolation, which has been our trend in our current culture. People are lonely and isolated and fearful because they're alone. We are social beings, and unless we do this together, the focus being together, recognizing our human limitations, but together we can do incredible things. So we're done, John?
Yes, I think we are. David, are you going to pass Jean to us, or is she?
Yeah, I'm going to provide the thank you today to Gordon because Jean is in fact not here. I wanted first to say that there's an interesting link to something that Judith said that I think you will appreciate, Gordon. And that is that if you look into the federal legal system in Canada, what you'll find is that the definition of the environment includes humans. It includes people. I think this is often not adequately appreciated. We seem to separate out our society from our environment, which is unfortunate. So I want to thank you very much for a very stimulating talk today. Thank you. And I hope we'll see you again. And for everybody who's still on the call and for people who are looking at the recording, I hope you enjoyed it. I invite you to join the club if you wish. You can find everything you will need on our website. You can join our newsletters called Stay Informed on the site. You don't have to be a member to get that. If you wish to make a tax-deductible donation, you can do that if you're in Canada. And I hope that you will look for our work on YouTube and on our website, that you'll subscribe, and that we'll see you again. Thank you, everybody.